So we had a shared agenda. I was interested in bringing this equity lens and wanting to think outside the box and wanting to learn, what have AIDP done? And you've heard from Diana, she wanted to really kind of explore, what have we done? And one of the things that was going on also that I learned through the research project is that oftentimes, because AIDP workers were doing things a little bit differently, they were often criticized and not understood and not valued. And that was something that we talked about through our conversations. But I just wanted to touch on something that Diana said. You said earlier, and you said research is a 4-letter word. I don't know what 4-letter word that is. So there was a book written by a Maori scholar who is internationally renowned, Linda Tahuiwai Smith, who some of you might know that book. And her book really brought to light internationally, although many communities have known it for a long time, the colonizing impacts of research and how it had been used and is still used as part of the colonial project, right? So you can't separate knowledge from power, and that she was really shining a light on how has research benefited Indigenous peoples. How is it, it's been used to exploit, take away further careers of the researcher without benefits to the community and appropriated knowledge in the process. And I was really conscious of not taking part in that. And so because of my positionality, I still very much am. And one of the essences, I think, of doing this work, and it's complex, but it sounds really simple, and you will know this, is relationships. The way that I worked in community as a white settler coming into our First Nations and having parents who were frightened of me at times, involved me bringing myself, not as an OT, but as Alison, as a mother, as a wife, as somebody who's got, stuff going on, bringing that into relationships and focusing on relationships with families. And that's exactly the same thing that I wanted to do and what I do with my relationships within research. It's focused on relationships. So what was nice is that when you do this kind of work, you have to kind of like the people and get on with the people in the research. Diane and I, we would talk. I felt we were transparent. We had different motives, but we also had a shared goal. And through the research, I continually asked myself questions. When I interview Indigenous parents, when I interview AIDP consultants, how can I do that in a way that will make this a safe conversation as much as possible, right? And so my motives when I was interviewing through this study, and I interviewed families in different parts of the province that had used the program, and then I interviewed regional advisors, and I interviewed AIDP consultants from different regions of BC. My motive in those interviews was that ideally that person or persons, depending on how many were in the room, would leave the room thinking, "Oh, you know what? That was good. That was okay." My agenda had to be put to the side. The priority in engaging in this kind of research is the comfort and the safety of the people that are in the room, just as when I was an occupational therapist. And so sometimes you got to park your research agenda. I had one time where I was interviewing a mom, and she got really upset. And so I said, okay, let's just stop there. And no, she wanted to go on. She wanted to continue our conversation. So we stopped, we hugged, we had a cup of tea, because I always had drinks and snacks in the room with us. I really wanted to try and make this a positive experience. The other interesting thing that I learned through the project that I've continued to do since with my research is that what can be really beneficial, and I was talking to Deborah about this earlier, is that often in the way we provide services, it's all individualized now. Parents don't often get to talk with other parents. And AIDP workers don't always get to talk and hear about what other AIDP workers are doing in other parts of the province. And so parents would say, oh, Oh, you've got that experience? Oh, I've had that. Oh, well, that happened to me. Oh, when that happened to me, I did this. You should try doing that, right? So the research in itself brought people together, or has the potential to bring people together, and through those conversations have almost a little mini micro positive effect, okay? The other thing that was really funny in this project for me was AIDP were outside the box. They were doing stuff that was not in their job description. And so I would talk to therapists, I would talk to AIDP consultants up north. They'd be like, well, I don't know if anybody else is doing this, but I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I don't know if I should be. Is there anybody else doing it? And then I would go somewhere else in the province and they would say the exact same thing. So by the end of the research, I was like, yeah, you're all doing it. There was a pattern. There were similar things that program consultants were doing. But they didn't know. And that was the beauty of this research, is that AIDP had evolved. And in the research, I didn't change what they're doing, but what I was able to do was to hear different stories and to bring those stories together and to think about them in the context of the lived experiences of the parents and the caregivers that were using these programs, and frame it together in a way that hopefully made sense. And then I had to take that back to those folks and say, this is what I'm seeing. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I just, to add to that is, back when we did this research project in 2015, there was only 48 programs. And something that I have, Aboriginal supported child development wasn't part of this research, just Aboriginal Infant Development Programs. So to engage the programs, to engage the communities, I know I needed to have the support and rely on the AIDP regional advisors. So even though I said yes to Alison, I knew I needed to still talk to the regional advisors and say, will you help? Will you help us share the information? Will you send out the questionnaires? Will you set out the meetings and the focus group information? And at that time, we had one of our regional advisors talk to me after the meeting and basically say Alison wasn't the right person for the job, and that's because she's non-Indigenous. So I wanted to just speak to everyone here and in cyberspace to say that I acknowledge, as an Indigenous person who supports Indigenous programs, who supports Indigenous children, that we need relationships right now with non-Indigenous researchers and evaluators and the folks who do that kind of work. Because we're still getting there in some ways. We have researchers, we have consultants here who do research and who work with other education institutions. But at that time, as we're still trying to move ahead, I needed that partnership. And it was, in my mind, a win-win situation because we got the research done. The people who wanted to participate participated. The people who were still a little leery or a little afraid didn't, and that was totally fine. We respected that. And so to this day, I encourage our young people who are in school to continue on and have really, really, really high goals, incremental goals, so that they're achievable and reachable, but to be those researchers in the end. So for me, it doesn't end at early childhood development. Keep going and become the researchers that we need. So that's a strong message that I share with our Indigenous people that are maybe still in school and doing practicums and doing their research for education. Say, keep going. We need researchers. We need you. So our relationship is based on the fact that it's respectful, and I acknowledge that we would love to have Indigenous researchers on hand whenever we needed it. But right now, having a respectful relationship and having this research was led kind of through us, through our provincial office, through our regional advisors, through our program staff. So even though the researcher was non-Indigenous, she kind of followed the lead, and we took the lead. And eventually we will have that Indigenous researcher in place. So I just wanted to mention that as part of that relationship piece, acknowledging that, yes, people were saying, well, she's not the right person for the job. If you go in and ask a question and she goes and asks the same question, you're going to get a different answer because they know you understand them because you are Indigenous, and it won't be misinterpreted. But we worked through that.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. And so, as I said earlier, I draw on what's called a relational worldview, or researchers use a fancy word, relational epistemology. That's really looking at the inseparability from who you are and what you know, and that we are always in a process of knowing. It's always dynamic. It's always changing. At the beginning of my research journey with AIDP, a friend of ours, Monique Gray Smith, gave me a book called Researcher's Ceremony, which is written by a Cree scholar from Manitoba, Sean Wilson. And in that book, he talks about his own research journey as an Indigenous man with his community. But he highlights this idea of relational accountability. And he describes how we need to be accountable to our relationships, to communities, to individuals, to everybody who is involved or impacted by the work that we're doing. And that we need to think about reciprocity, about responsibility to do work in a good way that benefits, right, communities. And the other thing that Diana touched on is this idea of two-eyed seeing. So some of you may have heard of that. Elder Albert Marshall, who's a Mi'kmaq elder, is recognized as the first person to kind of draw on this idea of two-eyed seeing, which is that you can bring an Indigenous worldview and a Western worldview together and create this kind of space where you can draw on the best of both, right? And I think that's what we did because of who we are. We kind of, I drew on a lot of Indigenous knowledges, actually, Indigenous feminist knowledges. Like I drew on stuff that we don't usually draw on to inform our work in early intervention, in order to try and really capture some of what the programs were innately doing. They were doing it. They just didn't have a way of framing it. And all I did was able to sort of theoretically frame it with them and for them in a way that's benefited. And so then we come back to the big so what question. So what was all that about? What did we do at the end?